And before I get into specifics of the bill, I want to mention who is on the floor sitting to my right. You know, my mom, Willie Mae Welch, is here in town. She's been here for a couple of days for activities going on outside of here. But, you know, sometimes things happen because they're just meant to happen. She was meant to be here today because the final version of a historic assault weapons ban is going to pass the Illinois General Assembly and head to the governor's desk. Many of you have heard me share the story of how Chicago gun violence changed my family's life forever in 1985. And, you know, it was only 5 months after my parents bought their first house in 1985 that occurred. So just imagine having 3 boys of your own, and 5 months after buying your first house, you lose your sister, and now you're raising 3 girls on top of that. So when I tell you a lot of what I fight for and believe in comes from watching my mom, the first woman that I ever loved, watching the values that she stood for and the principles that she stood for. That's where I get a lot of my fight. And so it is with tremendous honor that she is with me here today. And today, after continued negotiations between the leaders, stakeholders, and the advocates, we have reached a deal on one of the strongest assault weapons bans in the country. It's time that we protect Illinois communities. It's time that we protect Illinois families. Let's end families having to change overnight. Let's not lose any more brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles and children to gun violence. This bill has my full support, members, and I actually think improves upon what we sent to the Senate. And I want to thank the Senate President for being a partner in these talks and for the governor leading the way, for us working together to make history happen here today. What's different in this bill, the key components of House Bill 5471 includes immediately ends the sale, delivery, and purchase of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. This legislation includes a comprehensive, detailed, and updated list of assault weapons subject to the ban. High-capacity magazines are also prohibited. It strengthens the assault weapons ban by also allowing the Illinois State Police to update the list as needed. Those already owning guns on the assault weapons list would have to provide information to the Illinois State Police. Immediately bans the possession and use of rapid fire devices that increase the firing rate of semi-automatic weapons. That's something we should really be proud of. That's historic. Expedites the implementation of universal background checks and does not change the FOID card age. I can't say it enough. I want to thank Representative Bob Morgan for the work he put in on this. I want to thank Representative Moore Hirschauer for fighting for change. Representative Denise Swain Stoneback, Representative Willis, Representative Ford, Representative Yednock, every single person of the working group and everyone who took time week after week to make history happen here today. But I want to thank the advocates in the Speaker's Gallery who dedicate their lives to effectuate positive change in our state. They don't get paid to do what they do. They do it because it's the right thing to do. And so for them, I ask us to concur with Senate Amendments 3, 4, and 5. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would defer specific questions to Representative Bob Morgan.
Representative Windhorst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have questions of the sponsor. Will you yield?
Sponsor yields.
Do we know how many firearms in Illinois will be impacted by this bill?
The state of Illinois does not track firearm sales or what an individual possesses, so we do not know.
Do we have an estimate of the number of firearms that it will impact?
I do not.
Are you aware of estimates in the United States with regards to AR-15s that have them in the millions or tens of millions?
There are definitely estimates out there, but similarly, there's no national factual statistics about how many of these weapons are out there.
So we don't know how many firearms this will impact?
We do not have an accurate number, correct.
How many magazines in Illinois will this bill impact?
In a similar fashion, and actually even worse in the sense of magazines that they do not have serial numbers. There's no way for the government to track the number of these magazines.
But again, going to the AR-15 and using that as an example, there have been estimates of the millions of these magazines would exist in the United States, and at least hundreds of thousands potentially exist in the state of Illinois.
It's probably a fair guess.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Heller decision from the U.S. Supreme Court from 15 years ago?
I am.
And are you familiar with the decision statement that essentially guns or firearms in common use are protected by the Second Amendment?
There's a lot in the Heller decision, as well as the Bruin decision and other Supreme Court cases.
Do you disagree with my statement on Heller?
There are a lot of elements in Heller, and again, that's not the most recent Supreme Court ruling, so it also doesn't really apply to something like this legislation, which is not a concealed carry bill. So there are different elements, of course, in Heller that would apply to future gun legislation that's taken up by the Supreme Court, but as you know, as an attorney and a former state's attorney and prosecutor, that every case is held on the merits and is uniquely reviewed by the court.
The concealed carry issue you mentioned was the Bruin case. Heller dealt with the right to self-defense in the home and the right to possess a firearm in the home. The Supreme Court said that guns in common use are protected by the Second Amendment. So I guess my question is, if we are potentially banning weapons that exist in the hundreds of thousands in Illinois, wouldn't that violate the constitutional protection to guns in common use as dictated by the U.S. Supreme Court?
I look forward to the courts dictating that decision.
Are you familiar with the Bruin decision, which I believe you said you were?
Yes.
Are you also familiar that when Bruin overturned the New York State law, it also sent back to lower courts cases in Maryland, which had a semi-automatic rifle ban, California, which had a large capacity magazine ban, and New Jersey, which had a large capacity magazine ban? Are you familiar with that?
There are hundreds of cases that are ongoing with regards to firearms and firearm regulation, yes.
I'm specifically asking you, aware that the U.S. Supreme Court sent those cases back to lower courts to reconsider decisions in light of the Bruin decision?
I would concede there are a number of cases that are being sent to lower courts to review in light of the Bruin decision, absolutely.
Are you familiar with instances where the, again, using the AR-15, has been used in self-defense?
I think that there are cases in which an AR-15 has been used in self-defense and in mass shootings, yes.
To the bill. Everyone in this chamber is concerned about gun violence. Everyone in this chamber is concerned about violent crime and reducing violent crime. This bill is not going to reduce violent crime. The people who break the law, the people who commit violent crime, are not going to register their firearms, are not going to turn in their magazines. This will not stop that crime. What will happen is law-abiding gun owners will be yet again impacted by laws from this General Assembly, and yet again have their Second Amendment rights restrained. We have constitutional rights in our country. They protect our freedoms from the government. They are not rights that are given to us by the government. They protect rights that are sometimes unpopular. We protect the freedom of speech because sometimes speech isn't popular. We protect the freedom of religion because sometimes there are religions that aren't popular. We protect the press because sometimes the press isn't popular. We have these rights that are given to us. We see that in the Declaration of Independence, and we have that in the Constitution, and we should support, protect, and defend our constitutional rights. This bill violates those rights, will not reduce violent crime, and I ask for a no vote.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move to a 3-minute timer. Representative Mizaki
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
indicates he'll yield.
One of the things that the Bruin decision made clear is that when assessing any modern firearms regulations and whether they're consistent with the Second Amendment's text and historical understanding is you have to be able to find some type of historical analog to justify the regulation. So when it comes to the mandated transfer record provisions, what evidence do you have that this type of required record of transfers amongst private residents is consistent with the Second Amendment's text and historical understanding?
Thank you, Representative. Good to see you. And I would say the Bruin decision, of course, covers a number of elements, as you know, and I'm sure you have read it, as have I. It also alludes to the fact that there is a long precedent of exempting dangerous and unusual weapons as being permitted for a constitutional permissible purpose. So there are a lot of elements in Bruin, as I alluded earlier. This particular legislation, if we are so fortunate as to have to pass this in the coming minutes, I think that the courts will have their opportunity to review.
No, yeah, but that's not really responsive. Can you please put into the record whatever it is you're relying on to say that the mandated record of transfer provisions are consistent with the Second Amendment's historical understanding? Can you point to any other historical instance where these types of transfers between private actors were required to be reported to a government agency in the way that Illinois is proposing to do here?
Representative, we had over 15 hours of public testimony on this bill. I would
refer back to,
you asked a question, Representative. I would refer back to the extensive record with regards to this legislation that will be used by the courts.
Right. Well, the problem is that I've listened to that testimony, and it's not really going through the historical record in the way that the Bruin decision is basically required for all regulations going forward. And because the Bruin decision specifically took away the intermediate scrutiny standard that legislatures had been relying on and is now going to a standard of you have to actually have concrete historical evidence that this is consistent. You haven't put that historical evidence actually into the record. It's certainly not contained within the legislation itself as findings. So consequently, I'm trying to give you the opportunity to actually articulate what that historical record is, because without it, courts that have already been applying the Bruin decision going forward have been striking all of these regulations down. So if at the very least you want to help our Illinois Attorney General, I suggest that you identify what those historical provisions are, because frankly, I don't think you're going to be able to get there for most of these provisions. The sheer fact that you've said that here are some weapons, I mean, historically, the whole reason why the American Revolution was able to be fought is because people were able to buy and sell weapons of war in the private market. There was no restriction in terms of who was able to buy them and what people were able to do with them. And, so consequently, if you don't actually have a more robust historical textual analysis on this, all that you're doing is you're setting this piece of legislation up to once again fail. So to the bill, In Illinois, historically, we've passed all sorts of gun-related legislation, and historically, courts have repeatedly struck that legislation down. So if you want to argue why are we not seeing any change on this type of issue when it comes to the state of Illinois, it's because this legislature continues to enact legislation that is patently unconstitutional, is not going to work, is not going to actually stop violence in this instance. All it's going to do is give the courts an excuse to strike down yet another piece of gun legislation. So you all keep saying that you want to have common sense gun legislation. The only way you're going to have legislation that is going to pass constitutional muster is to focus on conduct of an individual, is to focus on things that actually are, for lack of a better phrase, outside the historical norm for the Second Amendment. And what you've thrown into this piece of legislation here guarantees it's going to be stricken down. So because I don't think it's a good idea for all of us who have actually taken an oath to say we are swearing to uphold the Constitution and the standards that it offers, every time you do this, you basically make a mockery of that oath. Thank you.
Representative Grant.
Thank you. I understand very well, and I have great empathy for what happened in Highland Park. We have a big 4th of July parade in my town, and it could have happened there too. It's very upsetting. During subject matter judicial committee hearings, I was able to hear testimony from numerous citizens in this state. On one incident during testimonials, I was struck by a distraught woman who was very concerned about gun violence in her neighborhood. Her question was, how do these young kids get these guns in their hands, ages 16, 17, and even as young as 14? Mid-November 2022, in Oak Forest, a gun range in a far south suburban neighborhood was burglarized. A group of 4 people had crashed a stolen vehicle into the building and stole over 20 guns. A 15-year-old boy was been charged. Just one of many possibilities to find guns getting into inexperienced hands for violent use. Thank you.
Representative STONEBACK.
To the bill. There is an urgent need to address gun violence through legislative action. Today is January 10th. 2023 has just barely begun, but already there have been 1,151 gun violence deaths in our country. Gun violence is the #1 cause of death for children in the United States. Gun violence affects all children, but children of color are at greatest risk. This bill bans assault weapons, large capacity magazines, and rapid-fire devices, establishes an anti-gun trafficking strike force, and makes other critically needed changes. However, assault weapons are only one part of an enormous problem. We need to do much more than this bill. We need more comprehensive measures that tackle the issue from all angles. We need to close the domestic violence gun loophole, which, due to confusion between overlapping laws, is allowing domestic abusers to keep their firearms during the emergency order of protection stage, which is the most dangerous time for a victim who is leaving their abuser. The vast majority of mass shootings involve domestic violence or intimate partner violence, so it's critical that we make sure we close this loophole and address the deadly intersection of gun violence and domestic violence. Effective background checks require fingerprinting, and currently, Illinois does not require fingerprinting to obtain a FOID card. A Connecticut permit to purchase law requiring background checks with mandatory fingerprinting done at local law enforcement agencies was associated with a 40% reduction in the state's gun homicide rate. Mandatory fingerprinting was among the top evidence-based policy recommendations made by experts at Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions in their report for Illinois published just last November. Another top recommendation, their first recommendation, was improving the implementation of Illinois' firearms restraining order. The FRO allows family members and law enforcement to temporarily remove firearms from someone who poses a significant risk to themselves or others. This bill makes some improvements to Illinois' vastly underutilized FRO, but much more work needs to be done to make this law effective. We need an Office of FRO coordination with statewide coordinators. We need to add licensed healthcare providers as petitioners and direct federal funding to critically needed areas by training judges, state's attorneys, clerks, law enforcement, and victims advocates. In addition, during this public health crisis, we must provide wraparound services to address the impact of gun violence, such as medical care, mental health treatment, inpatient and outpatient behavioral health.
Representative, your time has expired.
As well as, I'll wrap up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nelson Mandela once said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children." Gun violence is the #1 cause of death for children in the United States. I look forward to seeing this body pass critical life-saving measures in the coming weeks and months. I urge an aye vote and much more work ahead.
Representative Swanson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Indicates he'll yield.
Thank you. Where you at? There you are. Thank you, Bob. See you now. Hey, just since this is a new bill, I'm going to go through some of the same questions I asked before because I know things have changed. And a couple of these are new questions. My first question is, how does this impact gun manufacturers in Illinois and manufacturers of parts for guns in Illinois?
Some of the language is different from the last legislation that we talked about. This language would explicitly exempt Illinois manufacturers that are producing the firearms, the parts, and ammunition from sales to other states, to other countries, subject to federal law, and also law enforcement.
What about other states? They could sell to any other state then?
That's the way the legislation reads. There's a provision, I believe it's page 101, 102, that has an explicit provision of that nature.
How does this affect sales at the local hunting and fishing store?
Well, a local hunting and fishing store that is selling a firearm would be subject to this provision of immediately banning sale of any prohibited firearm or ammunition that's defined as a high-capacity magazine. And
some of the consequences of this bill then is going to be some direct revenue to our communities, and to our businesses here in Illinois when we limit the amount of sales they can have. So in some of our smaller towns that have the mom and pop gun stores, or some of our communities that have a larger manufacturer of parts or weapons, are going to be directly affected, and those communities are going to lose that tax revenue and business tax and potentially employment. So I see that as a bad outcome. Now, is there any languages in this legislation that directs or enforces or mandates criminals who commit a crime with a weapon to be punished for that crime? Or is there still opportunities for that to be pulled off the table?
I don't believe there are any references in this legislation dealing with those who have committed a firearm-related violent crime.
Okay, so now we're going to continue with the violence because we're not going to punish the criminal for using that particular piece of weapon. To the bill. My time is running very short here, so I've got to summarize. You know, this is going to directly affect many of my communities within the district with jobs, tax revenue, opportunities, employment, and just all those revenue things that we try to grow Illinois by doing. But here we're punishing those businesses. And once again, it's those of us who have guns or those of us who have our FOIDs and CCLs who will be punished and not the criminal for using that as a tool in committing a crime. And with that, I certainly encourage a no vote because, as I believe one of the speakers said earlier, it doesn't go far enough in the court system in punishing our criminals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader Flowers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the House. I want to take this opportunity to thank Leader Welch for his leadership on this bill. More importantly, I want to thank the Senate for the additional changes that they made to make a good bill better. And I want to thank you, Representative Morgan, for the hard work and the time that you put into the bill. As the couple of the previous speakers spoken said, in regards to gun violence and gun prevention, it's more to do than just pass this bill. And for the soon-to-be 39 years that I've been in this House of Representatives, I have been talking about two areas of the state. I've been talking about the South Side, and I've been talking about the West Side. My story has not changed. A lot of things about me has, but my story has not changed. And I said then, and I'll say it now, until such time that we began to make a serious investment in the South and West Side and other poor communities around this state, we'll be back. We'll be back, and we're going to be talking about the same things, and we're going to continue to neglect the poor people out there that's begging for jobs. We're going to continue to neglect the poor people out there that we're not educated, not giving them access to health care, not making sure they have a roof over their head, to prevent their hunger. Instead of giving them more food stamps or jobs and opportunities, we're taking everything away from them. We're penalizing them. We're locking them up. We're throwing them in jail. But we don't keep them there. We can't keep them there. And so, realistically speaking, I hope everyone, and you mothers up there, I extend my heart out to you, because if I could have bought 5 busloads of mothers from the South and West Side and other parts of this state who's been begging, please help my child. Please help me keep my home. Please help me get a better job. Please give me access to health care. I'm begging you, please. But no one listened. No one heard their cry. But you all are going to walk away today and you're going to feel good about what you've done. But those mothers, it's going to be business as usual. They're going to continue to go home and cry. They're going to continue to feel fear. They can't walk down the streets. Their kids can't go out in the park to play. They can't do nothing. Because a mind is a terrible thing to waste, and we are wasting young people's lives. So, with that being said, I would appreciate for those of you who believe in this bill, I'm going to believe with you until the next one. And I would appreciate it, and I vote. Thank you.
Representative Meyer.
Will the sponsor yield?
He indicates he'll yield.
I've been hearing from my gun dealers, and they want to know when and specifically how they're going to be notified, what the exact rules are, because so much has been changing in the last few days.
Thank you, Representative. I think that there are a number of provisions in here that will require notice to firearm retailers and manufacturers about disposal and transfer of firearms and high-capacity magazines that they currently have. So there will be, in my conversations with state police, quite a bit of guidance that will be coming out with regards to implementation.
But if the governor signs this tonight, when are they being notified? When is their cutoff date? Is it then? They're not sure of which guns. We need to know these things now.
Well, for manufacturers are exempt, as we discussed earlier, with any number of manufacturing participation of the firearms, the magazines, the parts with regards to the firearms. The retailers themselves will have to stop selling these weapons, which are enumerated in very explicit detail.
I would like an exact date. Maybe you can get back to me so I can tell them before the governor signs this bill the exact date and time that the sales have to stop. I'd like a list of the guns sent to them also. We want to make sure they get it. We don't want to turn any more Illinois citizens into criminals. And, you know, this is something that should have been worked out ahead of time. You've worked on this bill a long time, and you're leaving businesses, mom and pop businesses, in stranded there. Now, I also would like to know, what about somebody who dies? Are those guns allowed to go to their children, or is that not going to be allowed to be transferred because that's going to be considered a sale?
There are multiple provisions in the legislation that deal with passing a firearm to an heir. That also extends to the exemptions for law enforcement and retired law enforcement in their possession, transferring to an heir. So that is in the legislation.
And so you're saying that a father can leave his guns to his daughter or his sons?
In the event that they complete the endorsement process with the FOID card that we laid out, yes.
Even if they were named in this. Okay. Now, my next question. We have guns that have been sold, guns that have been ordered. The credit card numbers have already been ran. The money's taken out. The checks have been cashed. What's going to happen with those? Are they allowed to be delivered afterwards? Because there is a contract, there is a date there. The money's already been paid. How is that going to be addressed?
That language is in the legislation to allow those that have already been purchased to continue to be moved to the location for the retail.
So if they are purchased, they can be, and they can be sold.
Representative, your time has expired.
Thank you.
Representative Wilhauer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the bill. Now, I know that a lot of you guys over there despise our founders and you casually cast aside the principles that this country was founded on. But our founding fathers, they knew what they were doing. See, they had experienced the tyranny of the majority, and they vowed that that was never going to happen in our country. They said, never again will an all-powerful central government come in and crush our individual rights and our individual liberty. That's what the Constitution's about, protecting our citizens from a government that oversteps and encroaches on our freedoms. We are the greatest and most just country in the history of the world because we have always understood that our power and our destiny is in the freedom of our citizens, not an authoritative government. Our Constitution ensures that. Its amendments protect the delicate balance between the citizens and government. It's designed to ensure balance and put a check on a government that's willing to run roughshod over its people. Now, over the past few years, your party has proven its willingness to advance an agenda at the expense of the freedom and the well-being of the citizens of this state. We have lived out the consequences of a government with no check on its power. We all felt what happened during COVID when this body and Governor Pritzker took advantage of a crisis. You trampled our freedom. You used our children as pawns to perpetuate your political power, destroyed their education, destroyed our economy, and you left behind an entire generation. Never again will we allow our Constitution and our freedoms to be shredded by your political agenda. We don't trust you. Too many citizens in this state don't trust you. A government unchecked A government willing to defy our Constitution is a government that is completely out of control. So you can sit here and dictate whatever you want today. Maybe the political winds are in your favor here today, but I can tell you that we will not comply, and you're not going to do a darn thing about it, because the law, the Constitution, and the founding principles are on our side.
Representative CAULKINS.
To the bill. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard very impassioned speeches from the other side of the aisle addressing the needs of the communities that are most impacted by this crime wave. Nothing in this bill addresses those needs. The only thing in this bill is a burden, placing a burden on law-abiding citizens, people who have a FOID card, who have legally purchased and owned a firearm. That will not help anyone in any of your communities or mine. We need to address these issues. I commend the speakers. They know, they live it every day. And there is nothing that we're doing in this bill to improve the education or the economic situations in these disadvantaged communities. All you're doing is passing a bill to make you feel good, to live up to some promise that you made to a lobbying group. You have a serious problem. We do, all of us. We have a serious problem in our communities. Our kids can't read. They can't do math. They have no chance at a future. Nothing in this bill will make them safer or better. Nothing in this bill will make the people in these communities safer as they sit on their porch or walk down the street or kids go to school. I urge you to seriously consider what you're doing to a large number of law-abiding people in this state. We need to focus on opportunities in education. I know you all probably saw the report on the Chicago public school system, that the abuses that are happening to those children, the 100,000 kids that are reported as truant. I hope that's not true. But nothing in this bill is going to improve the lives of the people that you were sent here to help. And I would urge you, please, vote no on this bill. Let's come back next month and let's really do something that's going to have an effect on the people that we were all sent here to represent. I urge a no vote.
The final speaker will be Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the bill, please. I really appreciated the conversations on this issue, on this bill. These are issues we've talked about for really quite some time. They're passionate. We're very concerned. These are painful events we talk about. We talk about rights of individuals and the pain and the loss of life. It's very concerning to all of us. But I do not believe that this will solve our crime problem. Several counties have come out against, saying they will not support this. We've all seen resolutions from different counties, and this is not done lightly. And we need to be aware of what we're trying to do here today. The Sheriff's Association does not support this either. Let's think about what that means as well, folks. We just really need to consider what we are trying or considering today. And perhaps one more thing I need to bring up. This will greatly impact 2.4 million FOID card law-abiding citizens in the state of Illinois that strongly believe in their Second Amendment rights. 2.4 million Illinoisans. I do ask, let's try this again. We need discussion, and I do ask a vote no, please, on this bill. Thank you.
And the final speaker will be Leader McCombie.
Sorry, thank you. You know, as the woman in the room, I have to have the final say, right? I do have a question first off for Speaker Welch, please. we are going to be discussing rules and voting on rules when we come back at the end of January. When this bill was over in the Senate and it was hijacked to be the carrier of this bill, myself, Representative Hammond, and Representative Niemerg were on it in the Senate. So when you're looking at a firearm ban, and it looks like there's 3 strong 2A advocates on the bill, can we look, and this was not in my original letter, can we look that we will have the power or the ability to remove our names on a Senate bill rather than waiting for it to come over to the House? Would you be willing to think about that and consider that when we come back?
We'll think about it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, now for Representative Morgan. Representative, in the bill, it states that we are banning 50 caliber rifles, correct?
Correct.
Representative, are you aware of any mass shootings in Illinois that has been, the criminal has used a 50 caliber rifle?
I don't have a specific instance in mind, no.
Okay, how about in the nation?
Again, I don't have a specific instance in mind.
Okay, so that makes me want to ask, why put the 50 caliber on the list then? Because I'll give you the answer. The answer is no. So why put that gun on there?
There's a long, leaders, you know, there's a long list of firearms that are listed here, some of which are facsimiles. They're similar and comparable. They're copies, almost identical to an AR-15 or similar weapons. So there are a lot of different types of weapons, as you know, that are similar to other types of weapons that have been used in mass shootings.
So you're saying a 50 caliber similar to an AR?
You're asking about all the types of weapons in this legislation. I was saying, generally speaking, there are a lot of different types of bills, types of firearms in this legislation that are similar. Okay,
I was speaking just about the 50 cal, that's all. And it's not similar at all. Also, somebody was speaking, they were talking on your side of the aisle that they have the full support of the members and their constituents. The fact of the matter is there is not full support within this chamber or within the state of Illinois. So unfortunately, this bill, again, is not going to stop gun violence. It is not going to protect our most vulnerable neighborhoods or our most vulnerable children. Vote no.
Speaker Welch to close. Representative Morgan to close.
Ladies and gentlemen, the people of the great state of Illinois have been waiting decades for legislation just like this. Let them wait no longer. I urge and I vote.
The question is, shall the House concur in Senate Amendments 3, 4, and 5 to House Bill 5471? This is final action. All those in favor signify by voting aye. All those opposed signify by voting nay. The voting is open. Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Mr. Clerk, take the record. With 68 voting yes, 41 voting no, 0 voting present, the House does concur in Senate Amendments 3, 4, and 5 to House Bill 5471, and this bill, having received a constitutional majority, is hereby declared passed.